All right, one thing I want to talk about today is lists. So Python has what it calls lists, which in other languages are often called arrays. Basically, if we store, so far we've used variables to store values. Like if you're doing the average script, you have a variable called sum that you set equal to 0, and then you change the value of sum as you get numbers in to add to it. And then you maybe count the number of, have an index I that counts the number of elements that are in the sum. So those are just standard variables. Sometimes you want to store more than one value, and that's exactly what a list does. A list stores more than one value. So this is going to be something that is, very common in all programming languages, the idea of an array or a list. So to create a list in Python, all you have to do is set a variable equal to something just as you would normally do. But instead of setting it equal to a number, you set it equal to square brackets and then a list of, they don't even have to be numbers, but all we care about right now are numbers because we're writing sort of stream filters that will do calculations. So I give it a list of numbers. The numbers are separated by commas here. So this should be 0.5, 1.0, 1.5. If I print out that variable now, that variable is a list, and I will see all three of those numbers printed out whenever it happens every time. I don't know why I try to do that every time. I'll see all three of those numbers printed out. The really nice thing about Python is that you can just print a list and it will print it to the screen. In C++ or C or those other languages, typically you have to write a for loop that loops through all of the elements of a list to print them to the screen. So it's very easy to see what's inside your list. If I wanted to add a value to the list, I take the list that I have, so vals is a list, do dot append, and I give it the thing that I want to tack on to the end. This will append values to the list. So I can grow a list with this dot append. So if I print out the values initially, then I append 2.0, and I print out the values, I see that 2.0 has been added to the end of the list. And then the other thing that I might want to do is access individual members of the list, or elements is what they're typically called. So to get to each element, I use the list name, and then I put in square brackets the index or the slot position that I want to access. And Python is like most other languages other than Fortran that I know of. Most languages are 0-based. The first one is always 0. The second one is 1. The third one is 3. So index 0 here is going to give us, should give us 0.5. That's what you see right there, 0.5. And index 1 should give us the next element. That's 1.0. So that's how you actually access individual elements of the list. One of the nice features that Python has is that if you index a list with a negative number, it goes from the back. So -1 would give you the last element in the list, as opposed to a segmentation fault if you try to do that in C or C++. So one of the things that we're going to do today that will require a list is we're going to write a tail program in Python. So we've already wrote programs that do average, max, min. We could do a program that did head, right? Basically print out every line until you get to line number 11 and then just exit the program. If we wanted to print out the last 10 lines of the input, we don't know what the last 10 lines are until input's over. Right, so we have to store the lines that we might print out until the end when we know the input is over. So I just have some examples to do some basic list manipulations here. So I've got today's sandbox downloaded. I'm in today's sandbox. What's that? Ditto. Make sure I'm recording. I don't want to miss this gold. Yep, we're recording. So I'm going to start a little Python program. I'm just going to send the output of which Python to a file so that I don't have to remember where it's located for the shebang. I'm going to make that file executable, and then I'm going to open that file for editing. So first thing, we need to get that shebang in there. Now I'm going to open another file. Or another terminal. I suggest you do the same. Python being interpreted, you don't have to do any compiling to run it. All you have to do is save it and then rerun it. So I'm going to open up a terminal here. if I can run this script without closing the file. Let's see. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to start doing various things with lists. So let's just create a basic list. This is basically the example that I had in the slides. To create a list, I need square brackets, and then I separate the elements of the list with commas. I'm going to print out vowels. If I go over here, do a / lists, I get it to print out what looks like a list. Everybody got that? No syntax errors? Doran? Okay, no worries.
So basically, could you do that with just any variable? Is that, or is vowels specific to?
Any variable name. Yeah, you can use it for whatever you want.
Why do you want to open a second terminal though?
What?
Why do you want us to open a second terminal though?
So you can run it without closing the file.
Oh, okay.
Don't have to do a close, run, open back up.
I forget to actually save it if I do that. I can't figure out why it's still returning the same error.
I deleted everything, but it's still running.
I emptied this thing and it's still working just the same.
It's magic. Not working for you, Doran?
Oh no, I went to change mod and somehow, I see what I did. I'm dyslexic AF. I accidentally, instead of changing it
That's right.
to +X, I somehow created a file called +X.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
I was trying to figure out why it wouldn't run.
At least it wasn't
Rookie mistake.
TACX. Good luck deleting that. RM, no option TACX available. Got it?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh man, I should probably stop using O as a value in here.
All right. So there's several things that we might want to do with a list. One is to add a value to the end of the list. That is the .append member or method for the list. So when you have a variable that references a list, there are several things that you can ask the list to do. In this case, we're telling the list, please, probably not even with a please, add to the end of the list. And then I can print this out. I'm going to print out some dashes here just so that my output, you can see the difference, you know, like, oh, there's the first list that was printed out. Here's the second set that was printed out. So I print vowels, rerun it, and I get 2.0 appended to the back. There's ways to append things to the front. There's ways to take stuff off the back. There's ways to take stuff off the front. There's ways to add to the middle, to remove from the middle, right? There's basically all kinds of things that you can do, but this will get us through 90% of what we would need a list for. Syntax error?
Says print invalid. Line 9. Says print vowels. That's where my error is.
You have prints.
Put prints.
Prince. Going down to Walmart's. And see if we can,
Look at that.
Regular rate, not purple rate.
yes. Formerly known as just print. All right.
That's fine.
This is how I would print out just the first element. And I can actually set the first element equal to something by indexing it like this, which I think I will wait to do. So you could use, you basically treat vowels bracket 0 as a regular variable then. You could set that equal to something to change the value of that element. You can print it, you can use it in any calculations. Essentially, all we're doing here is there are times where it is convenient to have a single variable name that actually refers to several numbers at the same time, as opposed to having to create a new variable name by hand for every value that we might have. So I can print vowels 0. I can print vowels 1. That should give me the first 2 elements in the list. And there they are. Try changing that 1 to a -1 and see if it prints the last element of a list. Right? You can't go past the end though. So in this case, we've got 4 elements. So the indexes are 0, 1, 2, 3. So the index of the last one is 3. If you tried to print vowels bracket 4, it does not wrap around to the front. It will complain about something being out of range.
Should probably remember the vowels in there.
Don't forget the vowels.
Otherwise, it just returns you -1.
PRNT.
Now, when we do vowels, the -1, it's just like the last one in the list. It's not to like the largest one.
Nope. Nope. It just takes the last, whatever the last element in the list is, that's what it returns. So it's actually a really nice, convenient way to get the last element. In other languages, you'd have to track what the size of the list is and then index it at the size of the list. We can loop through all values through the list. So a for loop in Python takes, it's basically just like it was in Bash. For the name that I want to use for the value, right? Your variable name. So for val in, and then a list of things. So this vals is a list. If I run a for loop in Python, Python is going to run for every element in the list, the stuff that I put in the for loop, and it's going to load the value of every element into a variable called val. So the first time it runs, the first element in the list val will be set to the first element in the list. Second time it runs, val will be set to the second element in the list. So I can print val here, and this would be a way for me to print out every element in the list, and these are all going to be printed on their own lines. This is a very common pattern for lists, right? You create a list of something because you're probably going to want to loop through that list and do something with every element. So this should give me now 4 numbers that are printed, 1 on each line.
We don't have to put anything at the end of that for you.
Nope. The unindentation is what tells it that the for loop is over.
So now we're
So here I printed vals 0 and vals 1. And then here I just said for all values in vals, set this variable val equal to that. And then I could do a calculation with that. I could add it to a summation. I could, try to figure out if it's the maximum number in the list, whatever I wanted to do. The other thing that's common is to want to know what the length of a list is. And so there's a function called len. And if you give len a list, it'll tell you how many elements are in that list. So this should print out 4. Like, let's say that I wanted to calculate the average of the values in the list. Like, I could read everything from standard input, put it into a list first, then loop through that list and do the calculation. So in the for loop, I could do my summation, just like what we did in the previous class, right? So I'd have sum is equal to 0. Then I'd loop through 4 val in vals, sum plus equals val. And then instead of having to keep track of like a counter that increased every time I added a number to the sum, I could just use the length of that list to determine how many elements there are, right? So this should give me 4. And that's what it gives me. Another common for loop pattern that's used in Python for lists is to instead of looping over and getting the value of each element in the list, you set up an index variable that loops over all of the indices in the list. So like 0, 1, 2, and 3 in this case. And the way that you do that is you take the length of the val. So this is going to expand to the number of elements in that list. So this will be 4. And then there's another function called range, which turns into 0, 1, 2, and 3. It basically turns into a list of indices that are between 0 and the number that you give it as an argument. And so if I wanted to index the list variables directly, which I would have to do if I wanted to do a calculation that relied on more than one value, I would then be able to index the list with that variable I. So I is not the elements of the list now. I is the indices of that list. Yep.
Is it possible to call a script within itself?
All the same script.
Yeah, so like if I'm working with multi-dimensional arrays and I don't know when that's going to end, can I make one thing to crawl through each portion?
I don't know if you can call yourself, I don't know if a script can call itself in Python. It can in Bash, but I'm not certain that it can in Python. But you wouldn't have to do that.
Yeah, you just have to keep track of like an iterative value.
Here's 1,000 ways that you could solve your problem without me actually knowing what your problem is. So, you know, we could sit down and actually talk about what you want to do and figure it out. But my guess would be you would not have to have a script try to call itself.
That was just the easiest thing.
Yeah. So this is going to print out the element index and the value. So there we go. Index 0 is 0.5. Index 1 is 1, 1.5, and 2.
Oh,
This is a very common for loop pattern here is to loop through the indices as opposed to the elements of the list. So Python doesn't have, and I don't really know about Python 3, so I guess I should be careful here. But there isn't like a built-in for loop in the style of C and C++ where you loop over the indices. All Python for loops are for a value in a list of things. And really what we're doing here is this range function is creating a list of indices, and the for loop is just looping through that list of indices. So I think that I've got a demonstration of that. For example, if I print range 10, the range function actually returns a list that contains all integer numbers from 0 up to 10, excluding 10, which is the, you know, if you have an element, if you have a list that's got 10 elements in it, the last element's index is going to be 9. So that's not included in the list of numbers that are returned here. The other nice thing about the range function is that if you give it 2 arguments, it will start, the first value by default is going to be 0. If you don't want it to be 0, you can give it 2 numbers and it will be starting at 2, going until 9. It always cuts short of what the second argument is. Yes?
How do you know when to use brackets and parentheses?
Parentheses are when you're doing function calls. Brackets are when you are indexing a list or trying to create a list. So brackets are only going to be used for list manipulations. Parentheses are when you've got like a function that's going to take an argument.
And it'll complete if you use it not long.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
We want to
just for that.
reduce the number of complaints, number of errors per try.
So if we look at the output of range 10, that gives me a list of numbers 0 through 9. If I look at the output of range 2, 10, it gives me numbers 2 to 9. So that's what the range function is doing. The for loop is just taking every element in the list and setting the for loop variable to that element. So if I want to simulate something like a C for loop where the index is being incremented by 1 every time, I actually just create a list of all of the indices and then I loop through those indices. One thing that you can do if you want to remove elements from the list, there's a pop command, or not pop command, but a pop member, meaning pop off something from the list. So append will add it to the end. Pop, I think this 0 means it's going to actually take it off the front, but I'm not certain. I'm going to print vowels. Because I need to save this. So it came off of the front, so you can pop it off of the front. I think if you use pop without any arguments, it will by default take it off the back. I would assume it takes it off the back. So you can grow a list dynamically, you can shrink a list dynamically, as opposed to a C style language where you'd have to know how many elements you were going to put into that list. You'd have to create a list of the right size. If you needed to add more elements than you had space for, you'd have to do some machinery code to make that list grow. All of that stuff's already built into the Python list object. All right. Make sure this actually runs. Sure enough. All right, no syntax errors. So that's the basics of a list. Let's see when this would be needed. So let's implement tail and implementation of tail, not the fastest implementation of tail. If we wanted the fastest implementation of tail, we would just compile the tail program, right? It's probably a C program that's been around for 40 years, so I'm sure that it's highly optimized. We just want to do something that simulates or does the same thing as the tail command by default, which is that it prints the last 10 lines of standard input. So there's no way to know what the last 10 lines are until you've read the last line, and there's no way to know what the last line is until standard input shuts down and says there's no more input, right? So in our previous scripts that did filtering, we've looped over every line in standard input. If we were going to write a head program, we could have a counter, which we did in one of our loops in one of our programs as well, a counter for the line number, and once that exceeded 10, we would just stop printing out stop printing out lines, or we could exit the script, or we could exit the for loop. In this case, we have to wait until everything's been read before we can determine what should be printed. So my straightforward implementation is going to be loop through all of the lines in standard input using the file input module, store every line into a list so that I can have them all there. After the last line in standard input comes through, I will then go through my list and print out the last 10 items in the list. All right, so I'm going to create a script called tail.py. I'm going to make that executable by putting +x as the first argument to the change mod command. Dorn, note the order here. And I'm going to open that up. All right, put the shebang in.
I
All right.
prefer Vim to Nano. Like, is there a difference in their functionality?
Oh, yeah. They're totally different. It's just an editor that I got used to. And there's actually a chapter in the book dedicated to Vim. Yeah. And one of the reasons that it gives, which is a legitimate reason for learning Vim, is essentially street cred, just so that we can feel superior to our peers. Because Vim is a notoriously difficult editor to learn. You guys want to learn it? We can take a week to learn Vim. Absolutely.
One of mine.
I feel like we
I do need.
We definitely need that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can,
Where's that XACD street?
Nano.
The only reason I got the job at Orson's because I told them.
Oh, sweet, man. Teach us.
Do you like chickens? Check. Do you know how to use Linux?
You're hired.
Can you carry 2 tons of chain per day from this side of the store to that side of the store?
Yes.
That's not all that much chain, actually. It's only a couple rolls.
Okay,
4,000 pounds.
1 link at a time.
Oh, 1 link at a time. That makes it very difficult.
All right, so recall, just for practice, we're going to import the file input module. Do not name this file input.
Why not?
Don't touch a file named file input.py in your current working directory. And then the for loop to read standard input was for line in file input.input. So basically, file input.input must be creating a list of lines that we're looping over. It's actually a generator, I believe, but it's creating a set of lines that we can loop over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read all of the lines from input. I'm going to save them in a list as I read them so that after I get the last line of input, I can go back through the list and print out just the last 10. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to create an empty list to add every line from input to. And to create an empty list, I just do square brackets with nothing in it.
Why not? Makes it more fun to read.
And then inside my for loop, it's lines.append line. I like to use a lot of plural, non-plural versions of the same word, Joey. Maybe that's why you thought it was prints. I mean, when is it print? When is it prints? Line, lines. Very easy to get confused. So this is the for loop that will read the input. Now, after I read all the input, and how do I know that this is going to occur after it? Because this for loop that's looping over the input from the file input module is going to stop once the last line is read. So now, outside of that for loop, I can ask, how many lines are there? So how many lines were read? So I'm going to create a variable called numLines. And I'm going to set that equal to len lines, which is going to return the number of lines that are in that list. You know, I would probably, normally I would use something like capital in here. That's a very common variable name for the length of a list, but numLines is a little more descriptive as to what this variable is trying to store. And now I'm going to loop through the range of numLines. So remember, the range function takes a number, and then it will generate a list that includes 0 and all of the integer numbers up to the number that you give it as an argument, excluding that number. So if there was 10 lines in the input, that range is going to expand from 0 to 9. So for I in that range. And then I would just print lines, and I have to index the lines list using the index I. Now this right here, well, it's just going to print out all lines. This is going to be like cat. It's going to take all the standard input and it's going to print it out to the screen. So really what I want to do is I want the range to be confined to the last 10 lines. So let's go in here and give range 2 arguments. The first argument is, bless you. The first argument is the index that it'll start at. And what I actually want it to start at is however many lines there are minus 10. So if there are 15 lines in here, I want it to start at line 5. Actually, I think I want it to start at line 6. All right, so 15 minus 10. If I have 15 elements, well, let's just print it out, see what happens.
It would start at
If it doesn't, if it's got 11 lines in it, then we just go in here and subtract 1 from that.
start at 4. It was at 15. because it doesn't go
It's
to
at 15. It'll start at,
Start it.
so 15
The first-
minus 10 would mean the index number would be 5, which would be the 6th element.
Yeah.
Yes, this is going to work. This is going to give me the range that I want. All right. So how do we test this? Okay, I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm currently in the sandbox. I've got some files in the data directory. So inside data, there's a file called, or a directory called counts, and then that's full of a bunch of files that just have a bunch of lines in them, right? A bunch of data lines in here. So let's do cat data counts, and I'm just going to do the first one, 1.txt. So there's a list of lines. Now I'm going to run this through my custom tail program and see if it works. The last line, 137, that's 137, 170, that's right. And how many lines are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that works. We have spaces between every line. Does anybody remember what's causing this?
You gotta do the, there's a function, you gotta get rid of
There's a strip
strip line.
that we can take off the new line at the end of that line. And if we do that, then we'll get a single new line from the print function. So let's try that.
Index out.
There we go.
Yeah.
On which part? The last part? I added this. So I catted a file and then piped it to my tail script. Now this is not a very efficient method. In fact, if I had millions of lines in a file, this would probably break because I would be trying to keep a million, a trillion, whatever the number is, that is the max. I'd be trying to store too many numbers in memory. That's where your computer's memory is where that list is going to be stored. And so if I wanted to write a method that, or an implementation that wasn't going to run out of memory, what I would probably do is keep a list of the last 10 numbers that were lines that I had saw. And every time I got a new line in, if my list wasn't already 10 elements long, I would just append it. And if I got to the point where my list was 10 elements long, I would pop the one off the front, and then I would add one to the back, and then I could loop through those. Yeah, do a one in, one out, the rows method, not rows. All right, so here's what you got for the remainder of the class period. Write a script that reads a stream of numbers and calculates the standard deviation of the set. So you've already done the average, right? You already know how to calculate the average. Did I spell it wrong? What's wrong? No?
It's double.
Double?
Yeah.
No.
instead of float.
Flipped.
How do I get the signals?
Oh, I'm still trying to figure out the last one. I don't know.
I'll be right there. So this is going to require a list because the first thing you have to do is figure out what the average of X is. So you're going to want to read in the numbers, calculate the average. Then you have to go back through all of the numbers, calculate the deviation of the average from the average, right? So for each number, you calculate the number minus the average, you square it, sum all of that up, divide by n minus
Could you
1.
run your average script?
You
I don't have
Could
it yet,
not.
but-
No, you could not. In a bash script, you could, but in this case, you're gonna.
You could write a bash script that contains both those scripts. But like,
No,
close
thanks.
those.
I don't know.
And I have a typo somewhere and I'm not seeing it.
Look at it.
I know that I'm having a typo. It's for some reason the lines is not appended. It's saying that I have the
One of them is probably supposed to be line instead of lines.
Yeah, for line in file input, brackets, colon, lines, dot append, line.
Okay, yeah, import file input. Okay, yeah, lines equals
And
brackets, yeah, for line in file input.